Welcome to Chapter 3 of The Wreck of the Titan. In the previous chapters, we have learned about the Titan, which is the biggest ship in the world and holds a lot of records, practically unsinkable, and suspiciously like the Titanic. We have also met John Rowland, who is tipsy and fumbling all over the deck, probably spilled paint in the past, and now his supervisor trusts him with nothing other than sandpaper. And we have also met Myra and George, as well as Myra, another Myra. There are two Myras, it seems, and they're all very posh and stiff and unlikable. Chapter 3 of The Wreck of the Titan. When the watch turned out at midnight, they found a vicious half-gale blowing from the northeast, which added to the speed of the steamship, made, so far as effects on her deck went, a fairly uncomfortable whole gale of chilly wind. The head sea, choppy as compared with her great length, dealt the Titan successive blows, each one attended by supplementary tremors to the continuous vibrations of the engine, each one sending a cloud of thick spray aloft that reached the crow's nest on the foremast and battered the pilot-house windows on the bridge in a liquid bombardment that would have broken ordinary glass. A fog bank, into which the ship had plunged in the afternoon, still enveloped her, damp and impenetrable, and into the gray, ever-receding wall ahead, the two officers and three lookouts straining sight and hearing to the utmost, the great racer was charging with undiminished speed. So two officers on watch, which we had on the Titanic as well, but this was quite common with all steamships of the time and of the size. Three lookouts, actually. That's one more than the Titanic. Now, ships were sometimes in the practice of adding additional lookouts if the circumstances called for it, and given the gale and the fog, I would think they probably did add at least one more, so the Titan probably sailed usually with two lookouts. This third one is there for the sake of the weather. At 12:15, two men crawled in from the darkness at the ends of the 80-foot bridge. By the way, 80-foot bridge, so the ship is 80 feet wide, 10 or 11 feet narrower than the Titanic, just as a comparison, and shouted to the first officer, who had just taken the deck, the names of the men who had relieved them. Okay, so the first officer is now taking over the watch. Interesting, because at the time of the Titanic's collision, the first officer had just taken over from the second officer. Backing up to the pilot house, the officer repeated the names to a quartermaster within, who entered them in the logbook. Then the men vanished to their coffee and watch below. In a few moments, another dripping shape appeared on the bridge and reported the crow's nest's relief. "Rowland, you say?" bawled the officer above the howling of the wind. "Is he the man who was lifted aboard drunk yesterday?" "Yes, sir." "Is he still drunk?" "Yes, sir." "All right, that'll do." What? Are they criminal or just comical? I don't get what's going on here. "Enter Rowland in the crow's nest, quartermaster," said the officer. Then, making a funnel of his hands, he roared out, "Crow's nest there!" "Sir," came the answer, shrill and clear in the gale. "Keep your eyes open. Keep a sharp lookout." "Very good, sir." "Been a man-of-war's man, I judge, by his answer." "They're no good," muttered the officer. There's so much hatred and dislike for everyone else in all of the characters in this book. He resumed his position at the forward side of the bridge, where the wooden railing afforded some shelter from the raw wind, and began the long vigil, which would only end when the second officer relieved him 4 hours later. Conversation, except in the line of duty, was forbidden among the bridge officers of the Titan, and his watchmate, the third officer, stood on the other side of the large bridge binnacle, only leaving his position occasionally to glance in at the compass, which seemed to be his sole duty at sea. Sheltered by one of the deck houses below, the boatswain and the watch paced back and forth, enjoying the only 2 hours' respite which steamship rules afforded, for the day's work had ended with the going down of the other watch, and at 2 o'clock the washing of the 'tween deck would begin, as an opening task in the next day's labor. By the time one bell had sounded, with its repetition from the crow's nest, followed by a long-drawn cry, "All's well," from the lookout, the last of the 2,000 passengers had retired. Okay, so that's 700 more passengers than Titanic was carrying. Leaving the spacious cabins and steerage in position of the watchman, while sound asleep in his cabin abaft the chart room, was the captain, the commander who never commanded, unless the ship was in danger, for the pilot had charge, making and leaving port, and the officers at sea, which, by the way, is kind of common practice at the time. 2 bells were struck and answered, then 3, and the boatswain and his men were lighting up for a final smoke, when there rang out overhead a startling cry from the crow's nest. "Something ahead, sir. Can't make it out." The first officer sprang to the engine room telegraph and grasped the lever. "Sing out what you see," he roared. "Hard a port, sir. Ship on the starboard tack, dead ahead," came the cry. Interesting that he's shouting hard a port to actually turn to port. We know at the time of the Titanic and at the time of these ships, tiller commands were more common, so they would actually shout hard a starboard if they wanted to turn the ship to port. That gets confusing. I won't go into explaining why, but I do know the author was actually quite experienced at sea. I wonder why he didn't do it. Maybe he deliberately chose not to use the tiller commands because it would confuse his readers, and rightly so, because it still confuses everyone today. "Port your wheel hard over," repeated the first officer to the quartermaster at the helm, who answered and obeyed. Nothing as yet could be seen from the bridge. The powerful steering engine in the stern ground the rudder over, but before 3 degrees on the compass card were traversed by the lubber's point, a seeming thickening of the darkness and fog ahead resolved itself into the square sails of a deep-laden ship crossing the Titan's bow, not half her length away. "Hell and damn," growled the first officer. And it's censored, too, by the way. H-L and D-. Heck and darn. He should have just said heck and darn if he doesn't want to say those words. Can you imagine that? An officer on the bridge. Heck and darn. Oh, heck and darn. "Steady on your course, quartermaster," he shouted. "Stand from under on deck." He turned a lever which closed the compartments, pushed a button marked "Captain's Room," and crouched down, awaiting the crash. Okay, he's going to crouch down. Yeah, that'll help you. You're towering over the other ship. You just crouch down. Okay, sure. And ring for the captain. Call for help and duck and cover. There was hardly a crash. A slight jar shook the forward end of the Titan, and sliding down her fore-topmast stay and rattling on deck came a shower of small spars, sails, blocks, and wire rope. Then, in the darkness to the starboard and port, 2 darker shapes shot by, the 2 halves of the ship she had cut through, and from one of these shapes, where still burned a binnacle light, was heard high above the confused murmur of shouts and shrieks a sailorly voice. "May the curse of God light on you and your cheese knife, you brass-bound murderers. Curse your cheese knife." Oh, heck and darn. This is good. The shapes were swallowed in the blackness astern. The cries were hushed by the clamor of the gale, and the steamship Titan swung back to her course, and every other crewman on deck mocked the officer for ducking in cover. Not really, but I'm sure they did. Or where was I? The first officer had not turned the lever of the engine room telegraph. So he didn't do anything to slow the ship down, he just kept it going at full speed. The boatswain bounded up the steps of the bridge for instructions. Put men at the hatches and doors. Send everyone who comes on deck to the chart room. Tell the watchman to notice what the passengers have learned and clear away that wreck forward as soon as possible. The voice of the officer was hoarse and strained as he gave these directions, and the "aye, aye, sir" of the boatswain was uttered in a gasp. So they're going to try to cover this one up. This is one naughty officer. And yet, he does not feel comfortable saying heck and darn. Hell and damn. Or whatever. I don't get this book. I love it. It's so fun. I don't get it. End of chapter 3. Oh, heck and darn.
Did you mention how this is like the New York?
Yeah, thank you, Emma. I was going to mention, that's the note I actually had written aside. Okay, so this is not the collision that does the Titan in. That's an iceberg. Spoiler alert. It's an iceberg in a couple chapters from now. But the fact that the Titan runs down another smaller ship, collides with it while on the way to disaster, really reminds me of the New York incident, where the Titanic was leaving Southampton and nearly crashed into the SS New York, or actually the SS New York almost crashed into her. Now that crisis was averted. The ships did not hit each other. But it seems to me some overlap. A near collision, an actual collision on the way to what would be a fateful voyage. Very interesting stuff. Man.